And John, Rethinking Rewilding. I think it's a rethinking rewilding moment. This one is. I'd like to thank him so much for coming along to do this. It's going to be so interesting. This was originally going to be in the church hall, but obviously Zoom's taken over. In fact, it's 12 months since we cancelled our last event in the church hall. Every talk since then has been on Zoom, and this is 12 months right the way through. As a director of the Snowdonia Society, he's, I'm sure, really busy. He's told me that already. He's been super busy at the moment, but he's taking time out to come here to talk to us tonight. Over the past 7 years, he's overseen great progress in conservation, training, and public engagement programs, led a number of campaigns, most notably the one for the protection of Conwy Falls. He's been living locally for a lot longer than that, so 7 years, and has wide experience of conservation management, ecological surveying, biodiversity assessments whilst working. But he also knows his wildlife. I know he knows his wildlife so well, and he has a particular liking for the small stuff. Well, I think I'm right maybe on that. I know him mostly personally, I suppose, from his visits to Pensuckans, often on moth events, for which we have similar liking. Okay, but that's enough from me and enough about John. I think we need to see him. So it's kind of over to you now, John. Off you.
Diolch Mark a Jill. Noswaith dda pawb. Diolch am dod allan ar noson mor wyntog ac oer. Mae'n dewr iawn. Thank you for coming out on such a cold and windy night, folks. It's very brave of you. I've got a lot to say. I hope that you'll enjoy the things I've got to show you. I hope that somewhere along the way on the journey that we're going on this evening, you will find something of interest, something that makes you think, maybe something that prompts a question. I have got a lot of ground to cover, so you're going to have to pay attention, folks. So I'm going to dive straight into the presentation. And I will ask Mark just to confirm when he can see that this is working. Okay, there we are. Okay, Rethinking Rewilding. I should say before I start, this talk is what I have to say tonight is definitely my views. Don't assume just because I work for the Snowdonia Society that that these are the Snowdonia Society's views. They're very much my views, and I'm happy to share them with you. This talk, it's the third time I've given a talk with this name, but things have changed a lot since November 2019, when I first gave a talk with this title. And at a very simple level, in November 2019, I gave this talk at Plaza Brenin, and the big hall in Plaza Brenin was so full of people that they had to turn people away. There were over 200 people squashed in. Now, imagining a single room with 200 people squashed into it these days is a very strange thought indeed. But something else has changed since November 2019. When I gave that talk, I knew that there were aspects of the rewilding question that I hadn't resolved myself. There probably still are, but I think I have resolved one or two of them for myself since then. And hence this talk is actually a very different talk from the one that I gave just a year and a bit ago. Which is good news for any of you who were there, because it means you're not getting the same talk twice. So, rewilding. What does it mean? And how does it relate to conservation? Some different perspectives on that. That's what I'm going to try to give you. And underlying that some thoughts about how important the words we use are. So much of conservation is actually about the conversation, and the words that we use in that conversation really do matter. And hopefully through this there will also be some positive pointers as to how this conversation about rewilding and conservation can point us in the right direction. Now, nature needs us. That's a starting point, and there's an asterisk on that because it's a statement that needs qualifying. We can probably, I'm guessing we can all agree that nature-rich habitats are under pressure, that wildlife species are many species are declining in distribution and abundance. I saw the State of UK Moths report that came out last week, and that shows some really worrying but also very puzzling complex trends in terms of changes in distribution and abundance, not as straightforward as we might think. I'd like to think that most of us, at a time when the words climate and nature crisis are in the news almost every day, that we all agree that effective action is urgently needed. Also, for any who've been following conservation for some time, you will all know that none of this is new, and that in itself is, you know, is part of the question. So, should we, as humans, should we look after nature, which is conservation, or should we set nature free? Should we liberate nature? And as someone who's been working in conservation for a long time, I know that conservation is a struggle. It is a constant set of challenges, and those challenges don't have an end. This work carries on forever. And as someone whose background is in conservation, I sometimes wonder whether rewilding is an attempt at finding a route out of the endless nature of that struggle. These are big questions. So where do we start? Well, we'll start with a definition. There are lots of definitions available for rewilding, but this is a current one and the relevant one. Almost everything that I say this evening will be UK relevant. I'm fairly parochial. I tend to think in UK terms. I make no apologies for that. It's what I know. So, the large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature can take care of itself. So that's the starting point, if you like. Now, starting from where you are, I think it's really important that we do start from where we are. Now, starting from where you are depends on who you are. If you happen to be Platyarthus hoffmannsegii, the tiny blind white woodlouse, beautiful little thing, then starting from where you are means starting in the nest of a yellow meadow ant colony. because that's where this little woodlouse lives. It knows nothing else, it sees nothing else. Its entire life cycle takes place within a wood ant a meadow ant nest colony. Now, we're not tiny blind white woodlice. So we start from who we are. We start as humans with a very long relationship with the land. We start as people who have left our mark on the land for thousands of years and have had a relationship of some sort with the land continuously changing for many thousands of years. Or should we start instead, rather than starting from who we are and where we are, should we start from where we want to be? Now, I mentioned the climate and nature crisis, and in both those terms, you know, if I take an example and I look at our peat bogs, where I want to be is that our peat bogs, personally for me, I want to be in a place where our peat bogs are intact, undrained, fully hydrated, and doing their thing the way they're meant to do, with the sphagnum mosses slowly accreting 1 millimetre a year at best. Now, to get to that place, there are no shortcuts. A peat bog can only, a healthy functioning peat bog ecosystem that does all it does for hydrology, for carbon sequestration and for wildlife, can only build up its peat accumulation at 1 millimetre a year. That is its limit. That is its ultimate functioning. And the species that are absolutely tied to those kind of habitats, like the beautiful cranberry here, that's what they need. That's the kind of time scale, those are the processes that those species need. So going back to our words, rewilding, in a literal sense, we had a definition in a literal sense, to make wild again. And I think this is important because the word wild is a very deep word with a vast array of meanings. And I want to spend some time investigating the word wild. If we wish to make wild again, we need to know what we mean when we use the word wild. I don't want to get bogged down in definitions and the like, but the word wild is important. And the word rewilding, of course, includes many different concepts. So if I sometimes generalize about rewilding, I apologize, but I will try to be clear about the meaning that I'm using where possible. The thing about rewilding is it's quite an attractive word in itself. It's an action word. It sounds like a new concept. It has instant green appeal, and it also has these overtones of righting a wrong, of putting something back to how it should be. That in itself is interesting because that suggests almost a moral dimension, which I think is very interesting in a conservation context. And we should also recognize that rewilding is a response to the biodiversity crisis, a response in itself to traditional conservation. and the response to these wider issues of environmental inequality, which have a long history in many situations, in many places, and in many ways. So, on the one hand, everyone wants one of these. This is where it's easy to attract attention. Who doesn't want one of those? Or one of these, in fact. Because it's almost universal that when they look you in the eye, these charismatic creatures do touch a nerve. And that is a thing of great beauty. And it's also part of the problem. That moment when that pine marten turned round and looked me straight in the eye from 6 inches away was an extraordinary moment. It was extraordinary for me to look into its eyes. But perhaps what was most important was that it appeared that for it, looking at me was nothing. It looked, saw nothing, and got back to eating its jam and peanuts. And that's important. This is about the relationship. So, on the one hand, when we talk about rewilding and we see the ease with which we can attach that word to charismatic creatures that look us in the eye, and when we see that there are many different possible versions of rewilding, there is an undoubted set of attractions there, connection points for a whole range of different people in different ways. And that is part of why it has, if you like, caught on in so many ways. On the other hand, the counter argument would be that rewilding is a term that had a meaning when it was used in ecological science, but having been adopted by the wider environmental movement, it has become what's known as a plastic word. And a plastic word is a a word that can have so many forms, so many applications, be used so flexibly that it ceases to have a real meaning. So that's a counter argument, a risk, if you like. And similarly, there is a line of argument which says that the problem with rewilding is that the rewilding discourse seeks to erase humans from the history of the land, seeks to place at the center of its vision a world, a land, and an ecology where people have a secondary place, or perhaps a place as an observer rather than a participant. So that leads me to a perspective, to take a long perspective, a time perspective. So, for instance, in the current interstadial, in the place, in the sort of the big cycle of geological time that we're in at the moment, this little window, in this little window, in these islands where we live, we can look back nearly 10,000 years to the arrival of the first people following the retreat of the glaciers, perhaps 6,000 years to when the Young Farmers Club arrived and began clearing land. And by over 3,000 years ago, the population of the British Isles was 1 million people. So there's some questions here, and I just want to follow this a little bit further. Those people who've been here on the land for those 6,000-8,000 years in different forms have left their mark on the land. And the land has a very long memory. And that memory, the memory of that relationship, of those interactions, is written in detail, in layers, in the landscape. So if you could time travel, and I'm talking about the British Isles here, let's keep it within bounds. If you could time travel in search of wild nature, where and when would you go back to? I'll play devil's advocate. Let's assume that people are the problem for nature. Well, here's a timeline. I'm sorry, it's a rather poor copy. It's a bit fuzzy. But what this graph shows you is the population of the United Kingdom from 43 AD to roughly to present. And it's a pretty obvious picture. If your view of wild nature is that it's probably was at its best before there were lots and lots of people, then you probably need to go back at least to 1800 according to this graph, because things shift rather rapidly around that point. It's not quite as simple as that. Here's another graph. This time, it's a slightly different timeline, but it starts at about 1000 AD, so the last 1,000 years. And you can see the graphs are very similar. But here it's split out into the constituent parts of the British Isles: England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. And if we then think about the land area of the British Isles and the population, well, it turns out that for at least half of the British Isles, the human population change since over thousands of years is really quite trivial. Go into the hills in Snowdonia and look around, open your eyes, and you will see signs of human habitation now abandoned everywhere. Ancient human habitation. The populations in what are now really, really empty parts of our countryside were very significant. We've seen a shift of the population overall from the rural to the urban, even in Wales. But the overall population change is really quite trivial. So it's a simple question, and it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek question, but are people really the problem? And if you could time travel in search of wild nature, where and when would you go? Right. And bringing it back to Snowdonia, Eryri. When we think of Snowdonia, some of us think of the mountains, or perhaps the rivers and the woodlands. But almost entirely, Snowdonia is a landscape, a cultural landscape, and an industrial landscape in the sense of the quarrying and farming and forestry histories, but a cultural landscape in the sense that it is the product of this long, thousands and thousands of years of association of people living on the land and using the land. So let's play a little game. If we think about biodiversity, which is why we're here, wildlife in North Wales, biodiversity is in that cultural landscape is unevenly distributed, valued differently by different people, and is always competing for scarce resources. And so the game, whether you're playing, wearing your traditional conservation hat, or your rewilding hat, whoever you are, the game you're playing is conservation monopoly. And on this monopoly board, the properties have different values. If you really want to attract a lot of attention, you go to Park Lane and Mayfair. You go where the big things with fur and teeth and bright shiny eyes are. Some of us feel a bit more comfortable in Old Kent Road, but I won't labour the point. There are a lot of challenges in getting around all the way around this board. If you want everything that's on this board, you want to have a clean sweep and win the lot. That is a very difficult ask. And again, this is a bit tongue in cheek, but this is another game in a way. And this comes from a real life experience I had. One day, nearly 20 years ago, I was walking on a footpath in North Wales, and I stopped dead in my tracks. This was early in the morning, and standing in front of me, almost on the footpath, was a roe deer. Now, if you've lived in the northern part of northwest Wales, you'll know that roe deer are very, very rare indeed here. They're not resident. They certainly haven't been for the 30 plus years that I've been living here. And to see a roe deer was something so unexpected that I just had to stand still for a moment while my brain caught up with what my eyes were telling it. Is that really a roe deer? And it was a roe deer. And it's the only one I've ever seen in the wild in northwest Wales. And I went and I told a friend of mine, a landowner. And this landowner is a very conservation-minded person. And he'd spent years planting trees and hedges on his land, looking after his land. And his response was, "Where was it? I'll get my gun." Because he had spent many years changing his own landscape, his own land, planting it up with trees to create what for him was a better habitat, a better landscape. When a species that recognized the value of his work came along and decided it would quite like to settle in there, that was a problem because, of course, it would eat all his young trees. So let's play another little game. Here are some sheep on a hill, and here is the most stupid headline that George Monbiot has ever written. Sheep are not the greatest threat to our countryside. I know that for a fact, and I would happily have the argument with anyone. I have seen land grazed very hard by sheep. Land that's grazed hard by sheep is not destroyed in the same way that land that is ploughed and fertilized and reseeded is destroyed. For nature, I mean, specifically for nature. So this is a very silly headline, but a very common perception. And then you get organisations like the Snowdonia Society and National Trust who go out into the landscape and try and put in place bits of woodland, hedgerows in this case, planting a new hedgerow, on a fabulous piece of land, Carrog, the National Trust land, working together to reinstate some natural infrastructure into the land there. It's a great project, but then supposing exactly the same happens as happened to my landowner friend, supposing that sufficient of those trees grow over time and the deer arrive and decide to settle there. Well, sometimes what happens is that you get more headlines, things like this. So let's just see, we've gone round in a circle. We've started with the sheep whose main crime is nibbling away at all the trees that would otherwise grow in the mountains. And we've gone round full circle. Now, you might take this as a slightly tongue-in-cheek a step further and say, well, here's another solution. But then, you know, you can't get away from the fact that when you look at these situations, when you look at the countryside, people see it with different views, with different eyes. A conservationist, a farmer, a tree planter, whoever it is, sees the land and what's on it differently. And this is why we end up with scapegoats. And the goats of Snowdonia are the great example of this. They take so much flack for doing what they do. Large, wild-ish, well, feral animals eking out an existence in really quite modest numbers. But where they cause damage, that attracts more attention than all the other problems that the countryside faces put together almost. So the words matter, the perception matters, different views, different voices. And you can end up going around some very strange loops here. And this question about attitudes, this is the Oostvaardenplassen in the Netherlands, the outcry over the deaths of animals there when when the populations of herbivores it started to exceed the carrying capacity. And this I don't really need to labor this. It simply shows how difficult it is to balance an experiment in rewilding with other sets of values that people also hold as important. Animal welfare, perfectly valid. You know, all these different views on the land, on the countryside, are valid in their own context for individuals. For me, bringing it back to the core word here, wild. For me, the word wild is a state of nature, and it's also a state of mind. And when those two chime together, that's when I know I'm in a good place. So, just to illustrate the point, a few of my wild places. They're where I can spend time with nature, and they're always framed for good or bad, for good or ill, happy thoughts and sad. And my wild places can be anywhere. What matters is that something in the place or in my experience of the place moves me. It could be so simple. It's that spot on the path that I walk almost every day, where the edge of the field meets the hedge and the stream. And as the light starts to fade in the afternoon, every day there will be small birds there, bathing, drinking, finishing off their day. Sometimes it's places where something has happened. This is Morfa Conwy. And Morfa Conwy is a difficult place for me. And for others, I suspect there may be others here who share this. Morfa Conwy will forever, for me, be a place of sadness. It's where I said goodbye to the belted beauty, this fantastic moth. Morfa Conwy was its last site in Wales. It's gone. The squeeze between the footpath, the dog walking and the golf course, and the inability to get the right management there, it were just too much for it, and it's gone. Now, if I were to go there, the fence posts would have little ghosts on them for me. And then there's the opposite places. Instead of ghosts, there are the places where the life is so bountiful that it fills every sense. Sight, hearing, smell. And then there are the unexpected places. These are common dolphins inside Holyhead Harbour. And it was lovely to see the dolphins there, but it was even lovelier that the bridge over the harbour was absolutely filled with the people of Holyhead, with their kids, all turned out to see the dolphins that had come into the harbour. It was absolutely magical. It touched so many people who might never otherwise have seen these creatures. And then, for me, there are the encounters with things that are special. And this is me on Unst in Shetland meeting Edmonton's chickweed. Edmonton's chickweed grows on one little patch of serpentine gravel on Unst and nowhere else in the world. That picture is taken like that because my face was a mess. I was streaming with tears. I can hardly talk about it now without the emotion. Meeting that little plant was so special for me. It moved me enormously. Its grip on this tiny patch of land, the fact that it had evolved in this place, that it lived nowhere else, was incredibly moving. And more than that, I went on a pilgrimage to be in its presence. And it was there for me when I arrived. And it's still there now. There's something very special about that. It's still there, clinging on to its little life, whether I'm there or not. That means something. This is my wild. This is the combination of a state of nature and a state of mind. So this isn't a misspelling. It's not really my favorite desserts. I'm not going to go on about various kinds of cake here. I am attracted to deserts of different kinds. So, and I've often wondered why that is. This is the Keen of Hamar. This is where Edmonton's chickweed lives. It is a desert. It is broken serpentine with very little vegetation. It is a cold desert. And I wondered why. It occurred to me to wonder why I'm attracted to places like this, why this is my special wild. So why do desert places sing to me? And I thought about this, and I realized that perhaps they always have done. This is a very battered old book from my childhood. And I must have read this book dozens of times. And it totally gripped me. It gripped my imagination. I saw the pictures of things like the pachypodiums that live in Namibia. And I just thought, that is extraordinary. That's like something from another planet, let alone another country. The fact that it existed, whether or not I could see it, was remarkable, captivating for me. And to this day, I have windowsills full of desert plants, including a pachypodium. And in that book, I read stories of individual species and plants, again, that moved me. So the little plant in the left-hand side there is a thing called, of that picture, is a thing called White Sloania crassa. And the book told me that it was presumed extinct. And that was a difficult thing to read. That meant there was no chance that I could ever see that species. Unlike the one before, as I thought, well, maybe one day I could see that species. This one, I knew that I couldn't. So we're talking about, what, 45 years ago? And then a couple of years ago, I went to a cactus and succulent show. And there on the bench was White Sloania crassa. Alive, flowering. It's not extinct. So the guy had oedd bod ar y dechrau cyntaf. In the beginning was the word. And the words in that book, I think, shaped my love of deserts, desert plants, and the sense of perseverance, I suppose, that goes with them, with all those things. So my favorite deserts, the Keen of Hamar, definitely. The Carneddau summits. These stony habitats do attract me. They are my wild places. The Cairngorm summits, another favourite. And this fabulous desert. I've been here recently. Well, not actually been there, but this is Mars. And it looks fantastic, I have to say. If conservationists love life, looking for life, and looking after life, it takes a little bit of curiosity and a little perseverance. Looking for life. This is what I love. I think this is fantastic. What's happening with the Perseverance rover on Mars, I think is absolutely brilliant. But it's also slightly bonkers. The amount of effort and skill and extraordinary ingenuity that's gone into going to try and look for signs of life on a barren rock. when we live on a planet that is literally overflowing with life is extraordinary. I think it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful, but it is also slightly bonkers. And there's another thing about this. I think it's extraordinary that we can do these things. And when I first saw what they were doing and how they were doing it, I thought that is a remarkable feat of human achievement. And then I thought, hang on, John, you work in conservation. Putting that rover on Mars is actually quite easy. No landowner permissions required. A single focus, everybody involved, completely on board with the same vision. That sounds a lot simpler than nature conservation to me. I'm being a bit cheeky here, but you get my drift. So, back to rewilding. And I saw a thing called 2020 vision, and I read it and I thought, is that a vision for a barren planet like Mars or for ours? So it says, a rewilding network will help propel rewilding to a whole new level so we can all begin to enjoy a Britain rich in wildlife again. Well, I'm enjoying it as it is. I have been my whole life. I could wish for it to be better, but wherever I look, I find wildlife. So I'm slightly bemused by that. It sounds like they need to rewild Mars rather than the Earth. But there we go. I'll move on. So, nature needs us, asterisk. We do need, I've talked about species going extinct locally or more than locally. We know the pressures are there. We need a conversation, an urgent conversation about how we share this planet, the planet that we have. And there's definitely no room for complacency. I know that as well as anyone, because there are really serious challenges. So long and thanks for all the fish is the message left by the dolphins in the Hitchhiker's Guidebook. When the dolphins left Earth just before Earth was demolished to make way for a hyperspace bypass. It's a good message, but the dolphins are still here at the moment. And if we look for a moment at the sea, it's full of extraordinary things. Life that is there. This is close to my home, there to be found, to be seen, to be experienced, like life from another planet that comes out to investigate you. I love the way it turns that sort of purpley colour to match the seaweed that it rests against. Encounters with life like that are extraordinary, and they are the richness of life in our seas is still extraordinary despite the industrialization of parts of our seascapes. So the dolphins are still here. The sea is a wild place. Like the land, it's full of wonder, and like it or not, we're part of the sea's story. So we think of the ocean, there's the sea, there's the seashore and the deep ocean. And deep ocean of extraordinary creatures like sperm whales, and you might think that's a long way removed from the British Isles, but it's not quite so far removed. Again, the sea is a wild place. And that was a sperm whale diving a kilometre or more in search of squid. And here's a sperm whale in North Wales. And the point being, the sea is still wild. The sea is full of wonder, but we are part of its story. So if you don't like grisly pictures, look away now, because that sperm whale, an autopsy was carried out, and that's one of the pieces of plastic that was taken out of one of its stomachs. So we are part of the marine story. The sea is a wild place, but our impacts on it are important, and we must understand that. Back on dry land, this is where I live now. I moved here 3 years ago, and this is a challenge. This is a challenge to me, because this is, in wildlife terms, a desert. This land is very productive agricultural land, 4 cuts of silage a year, immense amounts of nutrient inputs going into it. It's useful land, but for someone who loves nature, it's a desert, or it's the hyperspace bypass from the Hitchhiker's Guide. But wherever you are, there is nature to be found, and I think that's part of the story for me, is that we unlock our understanding through observing and thinking about what is there as well as what isn't there. So when I moved here, I started looking, and soon after moving, on a tiny stream, a trickle of water, I found a rock in the weary land, and there was an otter sprained. And I thought, well, that's extraordinary in this very agriculturally improved landscape, a beautiful wild creature like an otter. I don't suppose I've got much chance of seeing it, but it took some perseverance. And after a great deal of perseverance, I got some very, very poor quality video footage. But then with a little more perseverance, eventually, after 3 years, I was lucky enough to spend 20 minutes watching the otter feeding without disturbing it. That was an extraordinary experience for me. And the otter is a fascinating animal. Here it is, I've tracked it down and managed to see this beautiful large mammal. But of course, the otter is a species that has recovered in our landscape, is on almost every freshwater body now. And it didn't take rewilding to do that. It took a simple set of targeted actions to do that. First and foremost, removing the toxins from the food chain that were having the biggest impact on it, and then cleaning up fresh waters through improved treatment plants, etc. There's a story there. I'm going to skip a little. I'm aware the time is going on, so I'm going to skip on quite quickly. The otter is obviously a large mammal. One of the issues we have when we look at these questions is that we get fixated on the big, colourful, furred and feathered species like the woodpecker, but we miss the linkages, the meadow ants that are the main food of the green woodpecker, that are the home of the ants and that lovely little woodlouse. But the ant nests themselves need the sunshine and need grazing to keep the sward down, to keep the habitat suitable for them. We don't tend to focus either on the sheep or the woodlouse. We tend to focus on the green woodpecker, perhaps. And there are charismatic species like the red squirrel. Esme Kirby, the founder of the Snowdonia Society, was a big champion of red squirrels. I love them. I think they're wonderful, but I think they get far too much of the conservation resource cake. And Craig Shuttleworth is a brilliant conservationist who has done great things with red squirrels, and I think that on a good day he might agree with that. He's an intelligent conservationist, and I think we have a problem with the furred and the feathered dominating the resources for conservation. I had a bit of fun with the posters for my last talk, where I had nothing to do with producing the images for them, and the first one, someone applied this picture of what, I don't know, is it a prairie dog or I'm not sure what it is, and then the next one was interchanged with a beaver, so it didn't seem to matter what the picture on a rewilding talk was, as long as it was large and furry, etc. I'll skip that one. We'll just go on. Yeah, so conservation operates in the world of people and politics. And that means that projects work if they get people and resources on board. And I think if red kite reintroductions were starting today, which were very successful in places like the Chilterns, they would all be tagged as rewilding projects. And there is a risk there. If something is popular or easy to attach a label to, we end up in this game of picking winners. That is one of the risks of a rewilding focus that places emphasis on charismatic large species. So the iconography of that is obvious. We'd rather see something large and woolly with horns than something large and woolly, well, that usually has horns. And charismatic species and charismatic projects are very much to the fore in the current sort of view of or understanding of rewilding. I just want to say something, and I'll just say this first. I think this book, Wilding, which has been read by a lot of people, I think it's a fabulous book. I say that straight out. I think it's a fabulous book. So everything else I say needs to be taken in that context. The Knepp Estate, I'm sure most of you have heard of this. I looked on the website, and I love this. It advertises plenty of time to take in our astonishing wildlife, herds of longhorn cattle, red and fallow deer, Exmoor ponies and Tamworth pigs, delicate butterflies and dragonflies. I think that is brilliant. I actually applaud it, because when I look over my garden wall and see the cows in the field, they are part of the natural landscape to me. So I applaud it. I don't think that's how it was quite meant to come across on their website, but I actually support it, probably for rather different reasons. But it's important to point out, Knepp Estate is a 3,000 hectare estate. Estates have always led some aspects of conservation, whether it's from the royal hunting forests of the Middle Ages, designed landscapes, think Capability Brown, shooting estates and their target species, whether that's the species that they want to shoot or the species that they want to control so that they can shoot other species, high profile rewilding projects. And what links these? Well, I have to be brutally honest, when I think about Snowdonia and the land in Snowdonia, which is managed primarily, largely by farmers, these examples, the estate versions of conservation, are unified by having grand ambitions, huge, high ambitions, matched by almost unlimited resources. And how does that transfer to the ordinary countryside? I do not know. It does not make sense to me at all. So, and there's another element here. This is where I start to get confused, because rewilding and tourism seems to be quite an interesting combination. I've just today seen Rewilding Britain's response to the current consultation on the next land management support system, payment for public goods in Wales, the next agri-environment scheme in effect. And it says, tree planting on its own will not necessarily deliver significant nature-based tourism activities, nor will peat bog restoration on its own. But if the landowner is delivering multiple benefits in the same overall location, then there'll be much greater opportunity for creating attractive nature-based tourism activities, such as glamping, camping and safaris. Right now, with the tourism pressures on Snowdonia, I think that's a really interesting and odd focal point. Where does this model, exemplified by projects like Knepp, where does it leave the intensively farmed lowlands, that green desert that I showed you outside my window? And how does it help the small traditional upland farms? I think these are really difficult questions. So, the price of wild nature. Well, here we are. On the Knepp website, it's £50 per person for a morning to go and look for butterflies. £400 for access, exclusive access, that is, to the wildest part of the wildland. So who is this rewilding for? What is this exclusive access to the wildest of the wildland? This concerns me. And the rather poor picture on the left is the turtle dove that landed in the tree next to my garden. Here it is on the road where I put some seed out for it. Here it is with some other pigeons. So words make a difference. Words matter. Two more minutes and I'll be finished. I'm sorry it's gone on a bit long, but I'll be with you. I'll get there shortly. I just want to show, this is a timeline of words applied to conservation, and I think it's interesting. If we look at 1990, the Countryside Council for Wales, responsible for wildlife conservation, landscape and countryside access. That's its own words, as it was at the time. That was how it described its function. By 2013, its successor, Natural Resources Wales, its stated purpose is to ensure the natural resources of Wales are sustainably maintained, enhanced and used. Now, if you look at those two statements of purpose, there is not a single common word between them. I think that's important. And I think that that change of the words, when we see the words that are coming out from government, when we see how things are framed, that perhaps explains part of the attraction of the rewilding agenda. It's a response to, if you like, the retreat of nature and wildlife from the purposes of the statutory bodies and the general approach to conservation, or the abandonment of conservation in a sense that we've seen in Wales. Point out, Natural Resources Wales is stuffed full of really, really good conservationists. I'm talking about the purpose of the organisation they work for. So, very quickly, this isn't the name of a band that I used to like. This is two short stories. One about 10 years ago in Aberystwyth, when the Welsh Government's head of biodiversity and conservation stood up in front of a packed conference hall and told us that traditional conservation had failed and that we didn't need SSSIs anymore, because Welsh Government's new approach was going to radically change the way we worked. We wouldn't need small islands of protection anymore because the whole of the countryside was going to be better for nature. We didn't believe him, and we were right to be suspicious. 2 years ago in Snowdonia, a man came up to me and said, "I've got very well advanced plans to release eagles in Snowdonia. I'd like your support." He then went on to tell me that he had a license for releasing lynx in England almost in the bag. The announcement was due to be made any day. This was Dr. Paul O'Donoghue, a man whose qualifications as a charlatan seem to be improving by the day. And that these two examples, one from government and one from someone who describes himself as a champion of rewilding, are the examples of the kind of loose talk, the kind of exaggerated claims and belief in their own worldview that gives things a bad name. And that is why when I saw this sign, the penny dropped. And when I saw this sign, I was delighted. I was delighted because I realized something important. I realized that we are all on the same side. Nature, conservation, and farming are all on the same side. We are all in it for the long run. We are all dependent on a level of honesty and graft, of perseverance, of tackling the hard problems without hubris, without telling lies, without claiming that we can magically make things better. There are no shortcuts, there are no easy answers. For the species that need our help, and there are many of them, so is rewilding a paradigm shift for conservation or a plastic word? I don't know, and I've realized that I'm not really bothered, because I've understood that what matters is that we have the long-term application to land management that is exemplified in things like the Macher, an ancient system of land management which is fantastic for wildlife and is the absolute epitome of what people and nature create slowly over time together. A fragile system that supports beautiful things like the great yellow bumblebee. Now absolutely linked with the continuation of traditional low input farming. It can't survive without it. And nor can many of the other species in those same places. And for me, it's that link between the land management and the nature that is the key of this. This is where the extra value is. This is where my wild makes sense. In seeing the long history of the land and people playing out together. Land has a long memory. And this sums it up for me. Conservation, viewed in its entirety, is a slow and laborious unfolding of a new relation between people and land. It's been going on for thousands of years. We call it new because we've used the word conservation. Imagining different futures, which could go either way. So the struggle continues. Oh, I couldn't resist this. A luta continua or a lutra continua. So my perseverance with the otter finally paid off. So there we are. I've brought us finally to the end of our talk. Thank you for staying with me. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Diolch. if you want to come out of sharing, that'd be great, John. Thank you very much indeed. Hopefully people can see me as well now. Not quite sure how to add to that, but while people are maybe thinking of questions they might want to ask, maybe putting themselves on video if they wish to. If Jill puts herself on gallery view, she'll see people who might want to put their hands up and ask questions, or if you wish to write a question in the chat. Just a thought, John, from myself really. Is it your idea that, or your thinking that we should maybe look at the biodiversity that we have much more closely, that's kind of we have because of our relationship with the land, and is there, but we're not perhaps seeing it as well as we should, or are we often looking at the biodiversity that we've lost?
Well, I think there's two levels to that. One is that most of us are missing entire worlds of what is there. You know, that encounter with an octopus was within 10 minutes of my house. You just have to go to the sea at the very lowest tide of the year, and you can have encounters with creatures that look like they come from another planet. at another level, you know, the otter, I've lived in this where I am now for 3 years. That otter, if I were to say to, I've not told my neighbours about it. If I were to say to my neighbours, oh, I've got a rewilding project, I'm thinking of introducing otters into this area, they'd all be very excited about it. The fact is, the otters are there, they just don't see them. You know, that's a good example because it's a large charismatic species that actually people simply don't see. But yeah, so my view is that we should always absolutely start from where we are. To start from anywhere else doesn't make any sense to me. There is, even in the most degraded landscapes, there is still a huge amount, and we must start by knowing what's there. You know, if you think about all the suites of flowers and insects and birds that use very specific habitats, if we don't start from them and their needs, we're starting from the wrong place.
Yeah, I can see, and of course we don't know exactly where we are, do we? Really, because there's so much we don't know. There are not many questions coming. Anybody want to put their hand up? I think that everyone's stunned into silence. I think you can't. I'm not sure whether how to interpret that really.
Yeah,
maybe
they weren't expecting to go to Mars this evening.
Possibly not. No, well, I didn't either. No. That was either inspirational or ridiculous. I'm not quite sure.
Or insane, yeah.
No, it's a fair point, and for a person who likes deserts, maybe that was could have been predicted, really. But there you go. I'm still waiting for a question. You really have to know. Go on, Jill's go on.
Well, no, I haven't got a question, but can I just say I was so pleased to see the ant woodlouse. Because we have ant woodlice here, and I was mesmerized when I first saw them in the ant hills. You know.
Yeah.
Lovely, right?
Yeah. So yeah, you don't need to go to Mars to see strange life. You don't even need to go down to the low tide to see strange life. You just need to look.
Yeah.
There is so much out there that, you know, I think this, you know, fundamentally, you know, I should be in favor of lots of the different versions of rewilding because I love all nature. But I just feel that if we focus on things that we haven't got at the moment, we are going to go wrong. We are going to make leaps of judgment, and we are going to just start off without considering the incredible richness that we do have, even in quite degraded landscapes, and we must start from there. That's my view.
You've got some questions now.
I've got some questions. That's good. There's Robert Gorzinski is saying, "Good evening, John. Rewilding, for better or worse, seems to be." I'm losing it.
He's there. Let him ask it himself, Mark. Go on. There's Bob. Hi, Bob.
You're there.
I've got to turn on my mic here. So basically what I was saying, John, was, you know, it does bring this incredible polarity. You know, people have really strong opinions, and sometimes we do get people who are going, as you suggested, way over the top, perhaps into stuff that, you know, does aggravate it even more. But my question really is about how do you think we can move forward on that in terms of, and particularly, you know, becoming much more inclusive about who's sort of in that debate, and also, you know, those people who have been most affected. And usually they're the people who are most disempowered and the people who are most stressed by climate change and environmental degradation. How do you think we could move forward on that?
Okay, that's a big question. I think there are a couple of things going on here. There's one which is a really nuts and bolts thing, which is right now, you know, we live in a country where none of the major political parties are advocating either population control or nationalisation of land. Whilst that continues to be the case, we have to work with what we've got. And what we've got is a landscape that is, you know, a very, very high proportion of which is privately owned certainly in Wales and in Snowdonia that I know, owned and managed by farmers. And if, as conservationists, we do not have a sensible, respectful conversation with farmers, we are wasting our time. So this is starting from the wildlife end of your question, because what I think we need, and again, I am thinking of Wales and Snowdonia in particular, I think we need to be working really closely, hand in hand, with the forward-thinking farmers who are looking ahead and thinking about the public goods that their land, the land under their management, can provide, and that includes biodiversity, landscape, and access, and these things. And we need to be really working with those, with the sort of the early adopters in there, because those are the same people who will be most likely to welcome in people to share their journey, you know, the journey of change. Those are the same people, and they are the ones, you know, if the resources are put into supporting those people, and they are out there, I've met some of them, forward-thinking farmers who are looking at how you use land productively in ways that also generates real public goods benefits, including biodiversity. And those are the people with whom that conversation could go a very long way. And now is the time to be doing it. We are in a time of enforced change. Minds have been, on all sides, have been prized open. You know, options have to be sort of followed up. And, you know, there is an opportunity there.
Do you think we have to become a little bit more humble?
In what way, Bob? In what way?
I think sometimes we can be very preachy, because I think a lot of us are very passionate, and it means a great deal to us, as you were saying in your presentation. And we like to think that we know the solutions. And sometimes we do that, I think, before we've actually taken on board how other people maybe perceive the same thing, but from a different angle.
Yeah, I mean, again, going back to the sort of practical side of things, yeah, I have definitely been guilty of being preachy. Through a strange set of circumstances, I found myself for 10 years effectively being a farmer, managing a piece of land, doing the farm paperwork. And I learned some humility through that. I learned to respect the scale of the physical challenge, the relentless nature of trying to achieve some objectives from a piece of land, interacting with all kinds of things, natural and human, that made that incredibly difficult, you know, incredibly complex. So I learned some humility about respecting the sort of farming side of the equation. I don't think we can get away from that. I think we need to understand that, and that development of respect is part of my mission. You know, I've learned that the hard way. I've still got the scars, you know, from that, and I know that those lessons I learned are useful lessons for the conservation sector, and I think there's something important in that. Yeah.
Thank you. It was a really thought-provoking talk. Very much enjoyed it, and totally agree about working with the farming community. Do you think that the post-Brexit payment scheme, you know, that everything's changing, is this going to really help farmers work with conservationists? Is it all going to work in a much better way than it used to do, you think?
Okay. Working in conservation, you have to hold on to what I'll call a golden thread of optimism, and there is an opportunity there. The circumstances are such, you know, it's a bad situation generally, but there is an opportunity, because change in the circumstances, change is inevitable. There is a real opportunity. I have to say, we are still talking about a scheme that's based on this idea of public goods, public money for public goods. The fact that that is still the conversation we're having is a positive sign. It could have retreated from that to something much more like what went before, and what went before didn't work for farmers and it didn't work for nature. So I stubbornly cling to an optimism, and there is still evidence to support that optimism. So I'm hanging on to it.
Happy with that, Maureen? Yeah. Okay. We've got a few on the chat here. I don't think anybody's got their hand up there. Fiona, did you want to kind of ask John your question yourself, or should I ask it? You want to? No. Fiona says, is there any way that is there anywhere that's being rewilded by humans, ceasing to manage and letting nature just do its thing?
I'm probably the wrong person to answer that question. In a sense, I have this very parochial view, and I look at what's happening around me. So I'm gonna pass on that question. Not my expertise.
Your expertise, okay. David Hayden, do you want to ask John your question? Give you that chance to unmute.
Yeah, it's just me. I was just wondering about the impact of sheep on the environment. I spent a lot of time last year walking in Cumbria, and I could see lots of sheep, and I was just wondering what the overall impact of the sheep are, or whether it would be better. I remember hearing a talk on the Long Mynd, and the ranger there was saying they've reduced the sheep from 7,000 to 3,500. So they thought the sheep were good, but not in the numbers that they were previously. So are there too many sheep?
Okay. There's a common confusion between the impact of sheep in particular, livestock grazing in general, and the other intensive management practices that go with that. So I say I managed a piece of land for about 10 years, a large piece of land, hundreds of acres. And before I took it on, I was told that this farm had been completely ravaged by sheep, that the stocking had been way over the carrying capacity of the land, and that it was effectively a green desert. And certainly wherever you went, the sward was incredibly short. But what I discovered over the course of over a fairly short period of time was that actually everything was still there. Literally everything was still there. The farm was actually unbelievably rich in life. It was just very, very small, very hard grazed, short life, some sort of small growing life. And what I learned from that was a very simple fact that you can have different levels of sheep grazing, and they affect the appearance, they affect the structure of the land, the structure of the vegetation. But their impact, even at quite high grazing intensities, is really not in the long term that serious. What is really serious from a conservation point of view is the application of heavy quantities of additional fertilizer inputs, ploughing and reseeding. That kind of agricultural intensification changes the land very rapidly, and it can take decades or centuries for the nature to recover from that. But to argue that the sheep are the problem is to mistake the symptom for for the cause, I think. So there's a lot more to it than that, but I think when I look at the landscape, I often think, well, if there were less grazing animals there, we might have more structurally diverse vegetation, which would be good from a nature point of view. But I very rarely look at habitats and wish that the grazing livestock weren't there at all. So this comes back to the question of how we incentivize management that we want. If we want payment schemes for land management, it's definitely about tweaking. For me, I look at the whole of Snowdonia and I don't see anything there that says to me that we need a radical solution. Everything I see in Snowdonia, I think from a nature point of view, can be achieved by tweaking the incentives, by tweaking the grazing stocking levels. That would make a huge difference. It needs evolution, not revolution.
It's very interesting, John, because I know sheep get a bad press sometimes. So
yeah,
you've got to get some context.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you. Mary, I'm going to give people an opportunity to actually put themselves on video and ask their own question. But Marion, would you like to do that? I'm quite prepared to ask the question, but Marion, would you like to do that?
Hiya.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, so I was just thank you, John. I really enjoyed that talk. So I think you've kind of answered it in a way, but I wondered, you talked about that it's really important how we appreciate what we've got and what's there. So suppose we get to a place where there's generally more awareness amongst our people and communities in terms of what we've got in our landscapes, or we monitor better what we've got and that sort of thing, then what would you say is the kind of the next step or the next sort of achievable goal in a way? I mean, you talked about kind of working with the early adopters and that sort of thing, but is there anything else that you'd say in terms of what you'd like to see, what your kind of vision is in terms of what's realistic in terms of what we can achieve? Okay,
well, there's a really big issue. I sort of very briefly highlighted the problem that when we look at the sort of big picture of conservation and in this this context of sort of talking around the rewilding agenda, there's a very common focus that sort of leans towards put it crudely, well, let's rewild the uplands because, well, what else are they good for? And there's all kinds of problems with that as a perspective. But I look at it the other way, and I look at the land outside my window in the lowlands, and I see that actually that is where the biggest challenges are. So for me, what I want to see almost more than anything, certainly more urgently than anything, is I want to see the land in the lowlands being managed in a way that is ecologically sustainable. And that means fundamentally, that means that the nutrient inputs going into that land do not basically outstrip the land's capacity to use them. Because at the moment we do have a problem. We have a problem that a very high proportion of our soils and therefore our fresh water is really suffering, is polluted by phosphate and nitrate, and that again, this is about how we put in place the right incentives, the right infrastructure, so that doesn't happen. There's a debate going on right now about what the tools for that are. But I look at the problems we have, and I think the uplands, a little bit of tweaking over a long time, because slow change in the uplands is good change. a little bit of tweaking over a long time will do the uplands fine. I actually think that, you know, we really shouldn't, as conservationists, we shouldn't be that worried about the state of the uplands. I think the uplands are wonderful. I know people would like to see more trees and more this and more that, but actually, largely, they are in pretty reasonable shape from my perspective. The same isn't true for the lowlands, and we need to start at the level of simple ecological sustainability, and that is avoiding the overloading of the nutrient capacity of the land. That again, that means a conversation and some tools to work with farmers, not just farmers. You know, there's other interests at play here. You know, how our own nutrient waste is managed is a big part of this too. But you know, that is to me, that is, you know, when I look at the land outside my window, that is the big environmental challenge right now, the urgent one that is affecting not just, you know, what wildlife is in the field that I can see, it's affecting the whole of the environment.
Thanks, John. Joanna, would you like to kind of ask your question? Give you the opportunity, you can unmute maybe, or...
Hi, thank John very much for the talk, and I think he's answered a lot of what I've said about specifically about pasture land and wanting to see a change in management on that. But that's really just one example, I think, of the fact that there isn't necessarily a conflict between farmers and conservation, but there can be a mismatch in the way they're currently working, and how do we get them to match up better? Yeah,
so this is really interesting. I was rushing slightly, but I put up a picture of that big sign that said that was put up in response to the first version of the Summit to Sea project. The big sign that says "Conservation yes, rewilding no." When I saw that sign, I saw it myself, and when I saw it, I have to say, my heart leapt, because the conversation between conservation and farming has taken decades to get to that point. Conservation, yes. That is an amazing statement. That is, you know, there is something fantastic about that. That is an achievement. And it has taken an incredible amount of effort and time and patience and translation and understanding to get that far. And I think that is where we are. You know, that's where we've got to. And I thought it was brilliant, actually. I loved Sean Sykes's talk on the Summit to Sea project. I thought it was fascinating that effectively what she was saying was that they you know, having got off to a rocky start, they'd worked out that, quite rightly, that having a big conversation was the way to move forward. And absolutely right. Totally correct. And I think this speaks to the fact that, you know, the relationship between people and land has been evolving for thousands of years, and we are all part of that. Nature, conservation, and farming, and other land uses are all part of that ongoing dialogue. And you know, there are no shortcuts. That was the point, in a sense. Yeah, we have to keep talking, and we have to keep talking and listening.
Ruth's got what she calls a short practical question. Do you want to put it to John yourself, Ruth? If you're there.
Where am I? Start video.
Start video. And
anyway. Yes, when's the best time of the day to see the otters? I know they're in the stream near me, but I've never seen one, and I'd love to see them. So what time do I have to get up or go to bed to catch one?
the first thing to do is to find the spraints. Have you looked for the spraints?
Yes, I have, and I've been told which rocks to look on, but I haven't seen them yet. I haven't seen it.
Okay, because that, but it's taken me 3 years to actually see one in real life. It's not easy. Basically, the camera trap that I've been putting out has been catching them at all times of night, and occasionally just sort of early in the morning, just after daybreak. But you need patience, and you need to basically, what you need to do is keep searching for the spraints, because the spraints tell you the pattern of behavior. There's a tiny little stream near me. They visit it probably twice a week, and they maybe leave a spraint there every couple of weeks. They don't spraint every time they come. They only spraint when they think that their beautiful perfume is starting to wear off a bit. So I think that's the sort of the key thing, is to build up a picture from the spraints of their activity first,
right.
because
Yeah,
without that, it's a needle in a haystack. You're guessing, unless you're prepared to get up very early every morning for quite a long time. It's tricky. It's tricky.
Right. Well, I have been told which rocks their spraints can be seen on, so I shall just have to keep an eye. I mean, I pass them just about every day, so I could just keep a diary.
Yeah, bear in mind that often, the big spraints are very obvious, but very often they're just leaving a tiny little blob of scent. So
right.
you do have to look quite closely.
I'll take my binoculars.
I
was just going to mention, sorry.
Yeah, they're just a brilliant example of a large mammal that's actually really quite common that people just don't see. And they are professionals at what they do. They're professionals at not being seen by people. Yeah.
And I was just going to say, there's a very good book by James Rebanks, Cumbrian farmer, who's lived through all the times of putting bad chemicals and everything on his land. And he's sort of coming out the other side and realizing benefits of a kinder, more sympathetic farming. Just to mention that anyway.
Yeah, and that's an important point in there, isn't it? There are people alive, who've lived right through the whole of intensive modern style farming, and right through the whole of modern conservation, in their lifetime. We need to take a bit of a longer view, that we have some urgent work to do. The situation isn't brilliant, but we also need to recognize that change on an extraordinary scale can happen in a human lifetime, and that has to be possible in a good direction as well as a less good direction.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Good talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. Okay. Fiona's got another question. John's comments about uplands versus lowlands and how people must start with where they are, where they live, prompts me to ask his opinion regarding Scottish Rewilding Alliance's mission for Scotland to be the first rewilding nation. Is this large-scale plant an effective mission or merely a grand scheme to impress?
It's really interesting that I'm freely admit, my view of the world is quite parochial. My view of the world is, what's outside my window. It's Snowdonia, it's North Wales. I did live in Scotland for 10 years, and I can say very categorically, Scotland is a very different country to Wales, physically and in its spirit. It is very different. So I would be very hesitant to pass comment in a Scottish context. The history of the land is different, and therefore the history of people's place in the land is different in Scotland. You've got this very deep seated sort of set of things around the sort of the huge estates, the shooting estates, the absentee landlords and all that kind of thing, which frame people's understanding of the land and their place in it and their rights and what they want from it. And it's very different. Wales is very different. Wales doesn't have that tradition. Wales has a really long tradition of relatively small scale farmers, managing the bulk of the land rather than sort of giant absentee landlords. We had the estates, but the tradition, the sort of the deep rooted, the popular sentiment is quite different. The trains of thought that go with that, and so yeah, I'm gonna slightly back off from that question, because I think it's for the people of Scotland to work out the answer to that one.
Probably quite sensible. There aren't any more questions that I can see, unless I've missed someone's. A lot of positive comments. If anybody wants just to kind of come on video and unmute themselves to kind of make a comment to John, that by all means do. He says, thanks, John. Tradition is so important. I'm just reading out a few before someone just breaks in and then says something. Thanks, John. Tradition is so important to acknowledge and respect. That's a good point that you've just made now from Fiona. Read James Rebank's English Pastoral. Have you read that? Have you got that? I've not got. We've got it on order, I think. Yeah, we've got it. Yeah.
Well worth a read, that one.
Okay. That's been mentioned in the past in other talks. Thanks so much for a really excellent and thought-provoking talk. If anybody wants to kind of come in and avoid me speaking all the time, that'd be great. Please just break in. If you want to do it in Welsh, even better, because I'm afraid I can't do that. Yeah. Does anybody want to do that? Hugh? No, maybe not. If by all means, please do. If not, frightening people. No, I'm not frightened. I'm terrifying people to come into video. But if not, I think maybe the time is going on here. Really, numbers are going down.
I'm going to use that opportunity just to apologise for going well over time. But let's face it, what else were you going to do tonight?
Exactly.
And we've still got 47 people here, John.
And while we still
fair play.
And while we still have 47 people, I'm gonna thank you so much for this evening and for what somebody said, an excellent and thought-provoking talk. I'm pinching that someone else's words again.
Oh, that well worth every minute has just come through.
Well worth every minute. And before we actually get the numbers go well down, if people wish to, even if they don't wish to ask a question or say anything at all, if they're happy to put their video on, unmute themselves and give John a round of applause, I think that's well worth it.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Coming again.
Hope to hear you again, John. Hope to hear you again.
It's lovely seeing you. Lovely seeing your name.